The morning light filtered through the courthouse windows in harsh, angular beams that seemed to cut through the marble hallway like knives. Jennifer Mitchell sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, her posture rigid, her jaw clenched so tightly that her temples throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., though she hadn't slept in 2 days. Sleep felt like a luxury she could no longer afford, a surrender to the nightmare that had become her life. Next to her, Sarah sat swinging her small legs back and forth, the motion repetitive and unconscious, a child's way of processing anxiety without understanding the source of her own distress. "Mommy, why do we have to be here?" Sarah asked for the third time that morning, her voice small and uncertain. The question was innocent, but it broke Jennifer's heart all over again. How could she possibly explain that her father, the man Sarah saw every other weekend, the man who taught her to count and helped her plant flowers in the backyard, now wanted to take her away? How could she explain that grown-ups sometimes hurt the people they claim to love? How could she tell her 3-year-old daughter that today, in a room full of strangers in suits, Sarah would have to answer questions about which parent she loved more? Jennifer pulled Sarah closer, inhaling the familiar scent of her daughter's strawberry shampoo, trying to anchor herself to something real and good in the midst of this legal nightmare. "We're here because some grown-ups need to talk about how much Mommy loves you," Jennifer said, her voice wavering despite her effort to sound calm and reassuring. "And you're going to help them understand that. You're going to be so brave today, sweetie. Can you be brave for Mommy?" Sarah nodded solemnly, though Jennifer could feel the tension in her small body. The child had picked up on her mother's fear like a sensitive antenna, amplifying it through her own developing nervous system. Over the past 3 months, since David had filed for custody, Sarah had become clingy, prone to nightmares, and reluctant to play. Her preschool teacher had called Jennifer in for a conference, expressing concern about the child's sudden withdrawal from group activities. Jennifer had tried to shield Sarah from the ugliness of the legal battle, but children were perceptive creatures. They sensed when the adults around them were falling apart. The custody fight had begun innocuously enough. Jennifer and David had separated 18 months ago after 5 years of marriage. The split wasn't dramatic, no infidelity, no abuse, just the slow erosion of connection that sometimes happens when two people grow apart. They'd tried counseling. They'd tried taking time apart. But ultimately, they'd both accepted that staying together for Sarah's sake would only breed resentment and sadness. The divorce had been relatively amicable initially. David had agreed to shared custody, and Jennifer had been relieved that they could co-parent without warfare. She'd even supported David spending quality time with Sarah, believing that a strong father-daughter relationship was important. But then David had met Veronica, a woman 15 years his junior who had no interest in being a stepmother. Jennifer had heard the whispers through mutual friends. Veronica didn't want children around, complained when David brought Sarah for his scheduled weekends, and had convinced David that he was being taken advantage of by paying child support. The anger that followed had been swift and calculated. 6 weeks ago, David had retained a high-powered family law attorney named Richard Thornton, known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to pursue scorched-earth litigation in custody battles. The accusations had shocked Jennifer. David's filing claimed that Jennifer was an unfit mother, that she neglected Sarah, that the child lived in a dirty home, that Jennifer's part-time job as a freelance graphic designer meant she was unreliable and inconsistent. The allegations were so grotesquely false that Jennifer had initially believed they would be instantly dismissed. She'd maintained a meticulous home. She'd structured her work schedule around Sarah's needs. She'd sacrificed promotions and social opportunities to be present for her daughter. She'd read every parenting book she could find, attended every pediatric appointment, volunteered in Sarah's preschool classroom. But Thornton was skilled at his craft. He'd filed motions requesting home inspections and psychological evaluations. He'd interviewed Jennifer's neighbors with leading questions, seeking to find someone who might corroborate stories of neglect. He'd requested Jennifer's financial records and medical history, fishing for evidence of instability. Most painfully, he'd scheduled a parenting evaluation where a court-appointed psychologist would observe Jennifer and Sarah together, ostensibly to assess their relationship, but really to build a case against Jennifer's fitness as a parent. Jennifer had hired her own attorney, Margaret Chen, a woman with a reputation for fierce advocacy on behalf of mothers fighting to maintain custody of their children. Margaret had assured her that the allegations were baseless, that no reasonable judge would separate a young child from a devoted mother. But she'd also been honest about the costs, both financial and emotional. The legal fees alone had forced Jennifer to take on additional work, spending more hours behind her computer and less time with Sarah, which only played into David's narrative. It was a cruel catch-22. The resources she needed to fight the custody battle were the very resources that made her a less available mother. The psychologist's evaluation had actually gone well. The woman observing them had noted Jennifer's warmth, her patience, her attunement to Sarah's needs. But Thornton had spun even this positive assessment, claiming that Jennifer was performing motherhood for the evaluator's benefit, playing a role rather than exhibiting authentic parental behavior. He'd hired his own psychologist, an expert who testified in dozens of cases, a professional whose reports had a way of finding problems that no one else could see. This psychologist had written that Jennifer's anxiety about the evaluation itself was concerning, that her need to be perceived as a good mother suggested possible personality disorders, that her willingness to involve Sarah in legal proceedings showed questionable judgment about her child's well-being. Jennifer's anxiety had been consuming her for weeks. She'd lost 10 pounds without trying, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. She developed insomnia so severe that she was considering medication. She'd had a panic attack at the grocery store when she'd run into David and Veronica in the produce section. Most terrifying of all, she'd begun to internalize some of Thornton's accusations. Was she a good enough mother? Had she been selfish to end the marriage? Was she harming Sarah by fighting so hard for custody? The custody evaluation had been scheduled for 2 weeks, and the psychologist had indicated that Sarah would need to be interviewed separately from her mother, a standard procedure, but one that filled Jennifer with dread. The idea of her daughter sitting alone with a stranger, being asked leading questions about her mother's care, made Jennifer want to scream. And now, this morning, came Sarah's testimony. Margaret had explained that while Sarah's words might carry limited legal weight, judges understood that young children could be influenced or confused. Her demeanor and her spontaneous statements could speak volumes. A child who appeared anxious and afraid might suggest an unstable home situation. A child who appeared confident and securely attached might suggest a mother worthy of primary custody. Jennifer had spent the previous evening trying to prepare Sarah. But how did you prepare a 3-year-old for the emotional minefield of a courtroom without traumatizing her further? As they sat outside the courtroom that morning, Jennifer gripped her daughter's hand and whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The courtroom doors swung open with a soft, deliberate creak that seemed to echo through the marble hallway like a harbinger of something significant about to unfold. Jennifer's head snapped up, her entire body going rigid with anticipation. Margaret had warned her that the proceedings would begin promptly at 9 a.m., and the wall clock indicated it was now 8:47. The bailiff, a stern-faced woman named Dorothy who'd been working the courthouse for 30 years, stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested she had something unusual to announce. But what came through that door wasn't what Jennifer expected. Officer Marcus Chen entered first, his uniform crisp and professional, his bearing the confident posture of someone accustomed to commanding attention in high-pressure situations. He was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes that seemed incongruous with his law enforcement role. Behind him, on a leather leash, walked a dog that immediately captured every eye in the hallway. Bailey was a golden retriever of exceptional beauty, Her coat a luminous shade of honey gold that caught the fluorescent courthouse lighting and seemed to glow from within. She walked with the measured, purposeful gait of an animal who had been trained to understand the gravity of her role. Her ears were alert but not anxious, her tail held at a perfect neutral angle, neither drooping with sadness nor raised with excessive enthusiasm. This was a dog who understood that her job transcended simple companionship. She was here to heal, to comfort, to transform fear into courage. Sarah's entire body stiffened. Her small hand, which had been gripping Jennifer's fingers with white-knuckled intensity, suddenly loosened slightly. Jennifer felt the shift in her daughter's attention like a physical force redirecting away from her and toward this unexpected presence. The little girl's eyes, which had been downcast and shadowed with worry just moments before, lifted slowly upward. Her mouth opened slightly, and a barely audible sound escaped, something between a gasp and a whisper, a tiny exhalation of breath that contained surprise, wonder, and something that looked remarkably like hope. Officer Chen paused in the hallway, allowing Bailey to stand still while he surveyed the waiting area. His eyes landed on Sarah, and he seemed to immediately understand the significance of what he was witnessing, a child's attention shifting from fear to curiosity. He'd done this before, worked with Bailey in dozens of cases, seen the transformation occur again and again. But it never got old. The moment when anxiety fractured under the weight of unconditional animal presence never ceased to move him. Margaret emerged from the courtroom at that precise moment, as if she'd been waiting just inside for the signal. She'd arranged for Bailey's participation weeks ago, submitting the necessary motions to Judge Harold Patterson, providing documentation of the dog's credentials, her training history, and the scientific research supporting animal-assisted interventions in legal proceedings. The judge had been skeptical initially. He was a traditional man who believed in the power of evidence and testimony, not the power of pets. But Margaret had been persuasive, citing case law from other jurisdictions, providing peer-reviewed psychological studies, explaining how Bailey could reduce cortisol levels and help a frightened child access her own authentic voice. "Your Honor," Margaret had argued in the hearing 3 weeks prior, "the minor in this case is 3 years old. She has limited ability to regulate her own nervous system under stress. A trained support animal has been scientifically demonstrated to provide physiological calming through petting and proximity. This isn't about manipulating the child's testimony. It's about ensuring she can access her own truthful memories without being overwhelmed by the trauma of the courtroom environment." Judge Patterson had granted the motion, though he'd done so with visible reluctance. He'd stipulated that Bailey would remain under Officer Chen's complete control, that the dog would not be allowed to interact with Sarah in a way that might be perceived as coaching or influence, and that either party could object if they felt the dog's presence was interfering with proper examination. Richard Thornton, sitting in his corner with his perfectly pressed suit and his expression of controlled disdain, had made a token objection but hadn't fought too hard. He'd assumed that having a cute dog present might actually humanize Sarah, make her seem more sympathetic, and therefore more credible when she testified to his narrative of a mother too distracted by work to properly care for her child. What Thornton hadn't anticipated was the profound effect Bailey would have on Sarah's entire demeanor, not through manipulation or coaching, but through the simple, irrefutable presence of unconditional acceptance. Bailey turned her head slightly as Margaret emerged, and the dog seemed to understand that this was significant. Her handler, Officer Chen, gave her a subtle cue, a gentle pressure on the leash and a specific hand signal, and Bailey began moving down the hallway. She didn't walk towards Sarah aggressively or enthusiastically. Instead, she moved with deliberate calm, her pace measured, her presence announcing itself through steady presence rather than demand for attention. Jennifer watched this unfold with her heart pounding in her chest. She'd read about the animal-assisted intervention program. Margaret had explained how it worked, shown her research, even introduced her to testimonials from other families who'd benefited from similar support. but seeing it in person was entirely different. There was something almost magical about the way this dog commanded the space without dominating it, the way she seemed to radiate safety without saying a word. The judge, visible through the partially open courtroom doors, glanced up from his notes. He too seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Other people waiting in the hallway, lawyers, bailiffs, families with their own cases, fell silent and simply watched. This wasn't a scheduled event. Word had spread through the courthouse that a support dog was being used in the Mitchell custody case, and people had positioned themselves to observe. As Officer Chen guided Bailey closer to where Jennifer and Sarah sat, Jennifer felt tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. She'd been holding everything together through sheer force of will, maintaining her composure, playing the role of the strong mother. But seeing this golden retriever appear in the hallway like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she'd whispered, it undid something inside her. "Sarah," Jennifer whispered, "that's Bailey. She's here to help you be brave today." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her entire body language had transformed. The trembling had stilled. The downward gaze had lifted. She was still scared. Jennifer could feel that underlying current of anxiety, but it had been joined by something else. Curiosity, hope, a sense that perhaps she wasn't alone in this terrible place after all. Officer Chen knelt down slightly, making himself less imposing to the small child. "Hi there, Sarah," he said, his voice warm and genuinely kind. "This is my friend Bailey. She's going to stay close to you today while you talk to the judge. She's very good at helping people feel brave. Would that be okay?" Sarah nodded, barely perceptibly. It was the first sign of willingness she'd shown to anything related to this legal proceeding. Margaret caught Jennifer's eye from across the hallway, and the attorney's expression reflected the significance of this moment, the shift in Sarah's entire being in response to Bailey's presence. "Let's go inside now," Margaret said gently. "The judge is ready to begin." As Jennifer stood and took Sarah's hand, the little girl glanced back at Bailey one more time. Officer Chen gave another subtle cue, and Bailey rose smoothly to her feet, ready to walk into the courtroom where she would become the instrument through which truth would finally have a chance to emerge unobstructed by fear. Richard Thornton watched them file past his table, still convinced that he controlled the narrative, still confident in his ability to shape the proceedings to his advantage. He had no idea that the dog walking into that courtroom was about to dismantle his entire case through the simple, irrefutable act of being present. The courtroom was colder than the hallway, more austere, more formally hostile in the way that only spaces designed to expose truth could be. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The judge's bench loomed above the room like a throne elevated beyond ordinary human reach. The witness stand sat isolated in the center, surrounded on three sides by tables where attorneys could observe every facial expression, every nervous gesture, every micro-movement that might betray a child's uncertainty or fear. Sarah entered with her small hand still gripping Jennifer's, Officer Chen and Bailey following behind them like an unexpected entourage of protection. The little girl's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow and rapid. She'd never been in a space this large, this formal, this aggressively designed to intimidate and expose. The courtroom seemed to dwarf her, to make her impossibly small and vulnerable. Every eye in the room turned toward the child, the judge from his elevated bench, the court reporters, the bailiffs, the lawyers with their yellow legal pads, the journalists in the back rows who'd been tipped off by someone in the courthouse about this unusual case involving a support dog. Judge Harold Patterson, a man in his 60s with gray hair and the weathered expression of someone who'd seen too much human suffering and greed, studied Sarah with an intensity that made Jennifer's protective instincts scream. The judge had agreed to allow the dog, but he was skeptical. Jennifer could see it in the slight compression of his lips, in the way his eyes narrowed as he surveyed Officer Chen and Bailey. This was a traditional courtroom, and tradition did not typically include golden retrievers providing emotional support to 3-year-old witnesses. Margaret guided Sarah toward the witness stand with a hand on the child's back, providing reassurance through touch. The steps up to the stand were surprisingly high for a child Sarah's size. She had to be helped up, her small legs stretching to reach each step. Once she was seated in the oversized chair, she looked even smaller, lost in the furniture designed for adult witnesses. Her feet dangled several inches above the ground, her chin barely visible above the edge of the stand. Sarah's eyes had been fixed on her lap, her small legs swinging nervously beneath the chair. She was dressed in the pink dress Jennifer had carefully chosen, a garment that Jennifer hoped might make her daughter feel special and brave rather than terrified and exposed. But nothing seemed to penetrate the fog of anxiety that had wrapped around Sarah's small body like a suffocating blanket. The child was trembling visibly now, her hands clenched into small fists in her lap. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, the respiration pattern of someone in early distress. Jennifer could see a telltale tremor in her daughter's lips. The court reporter, a woman with kind eyes, leaned forward slightly and said, "We need to speak up so I can hear you, okay, sweetie?" It was meant to be encouraging, but it seemed to make Sarah's anxiety worse. The child's shoulders hunched inward, her body shrinking further into itself. Then Bailey shifted slightly. It was just a small movement, the dog adjusting her weight, her collar jingling softly. But in that moment something profound occurred. Sarah's gaze, which had been fixed downward in terror and withdrawal, lifted slowly. Her eyes traveled across the courtroom, scanning the intimidating furniture, the stern faces of the adults, the judge looming above her. And then her gaze landed on Bailey. Their eyes met, the scared 3-year-old girl and the calm, knowing golden retriever. In that instant, everything changed. Jennifer felt the shift immediately, though she couldn't have articulated exactly what had transformed. It was as if Sarah's entire nervous system had received a message from Bailey's steady presence. You are not alone. Someone here understands fear. Someone here is gentle. Someone here will not judge you. Sarah's breath hitched audibly, a small gasp that the court reporter caught despite the ambient noise of the courtroom. Several people in the gallery leaned forward, sensing that something significant was occurring. Richard Thornton glanced up from his notes, his expression momentarily confused. Even Judge Patterson's skepticism seemed to waver as he observed the change in the child's demeanor. Margaret had been watching Bailey intently, waiting for the precise moment when the dog's presence would have maximum impact. She'd worked with Officer Chen and the nonprofit organization extensively. She understood the protocol. She gave Officer Chen a subtle nod, almost imperceptible to anyone not watching carefully, and the officer understood immediately. Officer Chen guided Bailey toward the witness stand with slow, measured movements. He didn't rush. He didn't allow the dog to bound forward or show excessive enthusiasm. Bailey's training was evident in every step. She understood that this wasn't playtime or a joyful reunion. This was a moment that required presence without demand, support without intrusion, love without conditions. As they approached the witness stand, Officer Chen positioned Bailey so that the dog's head was at the perfect height for Sarah to reach. Bailey didn't jump. She didn't bark or wag her tail with desperate enthusiasm. Instead, the golden retriever did something that seemed almost human in its understanding. She placed her chin gently on the edge of the witness stand, creating a physical bridge between Sarah and safety. It was a gesture that said, "I'm here. You can touch me. You are not alone." Sarah's trembling hand reached out slowly, cautiously, as if she was afraid the dog might disappear or that touching Bailey would somehow break the spell. Her small fingers made contact with Bailey's soft, warm fur. The golden coat was silky and real and utterly, completely present. The moment her fingers touched the dog, Sarah's entire body relaxed as if someone had released a pressure valve. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing steadied from the rapid, shallow pattern of anxiety to something deeper, more grounded. Her lips stopped trembling. The transformation was so dramatic that the judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to profound interest. A few people in the gallery wiped their eyes. Even the court reporter paused for a moment, allowing the significance of what was happening to register fully. Sarah's small hand moved across Bailey's fur in tentative strokes, and each touch seemed to deepen her calm. She was no longer lost in a cold, hostile courtroom. She was connected to something warm, alive, unconditionally accepting. Bailey didn't demand anything from her. The dog didn't need Sarah to be brave or to perform well or to say the right things. Bailey simply offered presence, pure, simple, non-negotiable presence. Richard Thornton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His strategy had relied on Sarah being overwhelmed, confused, possibly saying contradictory things that he could use to undermine Jennifer's credibility. But the child he saw now wasn't overwhelmed. She was grounded. She was present. She was, against all odds, ready to speak her truth. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, studying both Sarah and Bailey with new understanding. He'd granted permission for the dog based on research and legal arguments. But seeing the actual effect, witnessing the transformation in real time, was entirely different from reading studies about animal-assisted interventions. "Proceed," Judge Patterson said to Margaret, and there was something in his voice that suggested his entire perspective on this case had just shifted. Margaret moved to the podium, her eyes never leaving Sarah, watching her daughter's relationship with Bailey deepen with each passing second. The attorney had prepared extensively for Sarah's testimony, but even she hadn't anticipated how complete the transformation would be. This little girl, who'd been trembling and withdrawn moments before, now sat with her hand on Bailey's head, visibly calm, visibly present, visibly ready to tell the truth about her life and her mother. Officer Chen remained standing nearby, his hand resting on Bailey's back, his presence a silent reminder that he would keep this dog steady and present for as long as Sarah needed the support. The courtroom had fallen silent, everyone recognizing that they were witnessing something rare, a moment when the barriers between fear and courage collapsed, when a child found her voice through an unexpected ally, when the power of unconditional presence transformed everything. Margaret Chen stood at the podium, her legal pad filled with carefully crafted questions designed specifically for a 3-year-old's cognitive capacity and emotional state. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating how Sarah might respond, planning for various scenarios. But now, looking at her small client with her hand resting peacefully on Bailey's head, Margaret realized that all her preparation might become irrelevant. The question she'd planned to ask first was designed to warm Sarah up, to create a sense of safety through familiar topics. But Sarah was already safe. Bailey had accomplished in seconds what Margaret had anticipated taking 5 minutes to achieve. Margaret began softly, her voice gentle and carefully modulated to sound more like a caring aunt than a litigating attorney. "Sarah, can you tell me about your mommy?" she asked. The question was simple, open-ended, designed to allow the child to access her own memories and feelings without leading her toward any particular narrative. For a moment, there was silence. Sarah's hand continued to stroke Bailey's fur in slow, repetitive motions. The courtroom held its breath. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her stenotype machine, waiting to capture whatever words came next. Then Sarah's voice emerged, small but present, clear but childlike, authentic in a way that no coaching or preparation could have manufactured. "Mommy reads me stories," Sarah said, her words carrying across the courtroom with surprising clarity. "She sings to me. She makes me feel safe." The simplicity of the statement was devastating in its honesty. These weren't sophisticated observations. They were the pure, unfiltered perceptions of a 3-year-old girl describing the love she felt. But their very simplicity made them infinitely more credible than any elaborate testimony could have been. Sarah wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to please anyone. She was simply speaking her truth. Jennifer's hands flew to her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. She'd known Sarah loved her. She'd felt it every day in her daughter's embrace. in the way Sarah reached for her in the night, in the absolute trust with which the child had always thrown herself into Jennifer's arms. But hearing it spoken aloud in a courtroom, before a judge who held the power to determine their future together, felt like a validation that transcended all the legal arguments and expert testimonies that would follow. Judge Patterson, still watching carefully, made a note on his pad. His expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested that his skepticism about the dog's presence was beginning to shift. He'd spent 30 years on the bench, and he'd learned to read human behavior with uncanny accuracy. This child wasn't being manipulated. This child was being authentically herself, grounded, present, and speaking from genuine experience. Margaret continued with her next question, which was designed to explore Sarah's daily life with her mother. "Can you tell me about something special you and Mommy like to do together?" she asked. Sarah's face brightened slightly, and Margaret could see her searching her 3-year-old mind for a memory. The pause was longer this time, but it wasn't a pause of confusion or uncertainty. It was the pause of a child accessing genuine memories, sorting through the library of her short life to find moments that mattered. "We plant flowers," Sarah said finally, her voice gaining more confidence with each word. "Mommy lets me dig in the dirt, and she doesn't get mad when I get messy. We plant seeds and then we water them and they grow." It was a simple memory, but it painted a vivid picture. Here was evidence of a mother who allowed her child to explore, to get dirty, to experience the world without constant correction or criticism. Here was a mother who spent time with her daughter on activities that served no developmental purpose except to foster connection and joy. Richard Thornton shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. This wasn't the testimony he'd anticipated. He'd prepared for Sarah to either freeze up entirely, which would suggest an unreliable witness, or to become confused and contradictory, which he could use to undermine the reliability of anything she said. What he hadn't prepared for was a 3-year-old girl who was calm, coherent, and overflowing with positive descriptions of her mother. Margaret pressed forward, her voice remaining gentle. "Does Mommy take care of you when you're sick?" she asked. "Yes," Sarah responded immediately. "When I had the fever, Mommy stayed with me all night. She put a cool cloth on my head and sang to me. She was worried, but she made me feel okay." The specificity of the memory was striking. This wasn't a generic statement that could apply to any mother. This was a particular moment in time. Sarah had indeed had a fever 6 months ago, and Jennifer had indeed stayed up through the entire night, terrified that her daughter might have something serious, but trying to hide her fear so as not to alarm the child. The fact that Sarah remembered this moment, and remembered it as an act of maternal care and protection, spoke volumes about what this child valued and understood about her relationship with her mother. Bailey remained perfectly still throughout the testimony, her presence a constant anchor for Sarah. Occasionally, the child's hand would still on the dog's fur, and Bailey would shift slightly, just enough movement to recapture Sarah's attention and reinforce the grounding connection. Officer Chen watched this interaction with the focused attention of someone who understood the profound choreography occurring between child and dog. He'd seen Bailey work dozens of times, but the precision with which the dog seemed to understand exactly when Sarah needed grounding, exactly how much movement was necessary to maintain connection without being distracting, it was remarkable every time. Margaret's questions became more specific as she guided Sarah through her daily life with her mother. She asked about meal times, and Sarah described how her mother made her favorite pasta and sat with her while she ate, talking about their day. She asked about bedtime, and Sarah explained how her mother brushed her teeth with her, read from picture books until Sarah's eyes grew heavy, and then lay next to her until she fell asleep. She asked about what happened when Sarah was scared, and Sarah said her mother always came to her, held her, and told her that she was safe, that Mommy was there, that everything would be okay. With each response, the portrait of Jennifer that emerged was not that of a neglectful or absent mother. It was the portrait of a woman fully present in her daughter's life, attuned to her needs, responsive to her fears, and committed to creating a home environment of safety and love. Every example Sarah provided was concrete, specific, and psychologically rich with evidence of secure attachment and responsive parenting. The opposing counsel knew he had to do something. He couldn't let this testimony stand unchallenged. So when it came time for his cross-examination, Richard Thornton stood and approached the witness stand with the predatory confidence of a lawyer who believed he could intimidate or confuse anyone. But as he drew near, Bailey's entire body stiffened slightly. It was an almost imperceptible shift, but Sarah noticed immediately. The child's hand, which had been moving gently across Bailey's fur, suddenly gripped more tightly. Officer Chen gave Bailey a subtle signal to remain calm, but the dog's protective instinct had been triggered. She'd sensed threat directed toward the child she'd been supporting, and every fiber of her being responded. Thornton pulled up short, momentarily thrown by the dog's reaction. Even he seemed to understand, on some primal level, that attacking a witness in the presence of an animal who was clearly protective would not play well with the judge or the observers in the gallery. His cross-examination, when it came, was notably gentler than his usual tactics. He asked Sarah if her mother had ever gotten angry, if she'd ever raised her voice, if there had ever been moments of frustration. Sarah answered honestly, yes, her mommy sometimes got frustrated, especially when Sarah spilled things or didn't listen. But importantly, Sarah described these moments as brief, and followed by her mother's explanations of why she'd been upset and reassurances of her unconditional love. What Thornton had hoped would be contradictions that undermined Jennifer's character instead became evidence of normal, healthy maternal frustration, the kind any parent experienced, followed by repair and reassurance. It was, in fact, a portrait of a mother who was emotionally intelligent enough to acknowledge her own emotions while still maintaining the child's sense of security. As Sarah's testimony concluded, she was visibly exhausted but also visibly proud of herself. She'd done something difficult, and she'd done it well. Bailey had given her the courage, but Sarah had provided the honesty. The afternoon sun filtered through the courtroom windows at a lower angle than it had that morning, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Sarah's testimony had continued for nearly 2 hours, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Margaret had guided the child through detailed descriptions of her life with Jennifer, her routines, her sense of security, her understanding of her mother's love. With each question and answer, the portrait of Jennifer as a devoted mother had become increasingly vivid and compelling. Throughout the testimony, Bailey had remained Sarah's steadfast companion. There had been moments when the questions became more challenging, when Margaret asked about Sarah's father and why she didn't live with him full-time. These questions were necessary, designed to allow Sarah to articulate her own preferences in age-appropriate language, but they were also emotionally complex for a 3-year-old. In those moments, Bailey seemed to sense Sarah's discomfort. The dog would shift her position slightly, offering her head for Sarah to rest her hand against, providing a tactile reminder that she wasn't alone in navigating difficult emotions. Sarah had described seeing her father on alternate weekends, and she'd spoken about enjoying some of those visits, going to the park, getting ice cream, playing with toys at his apartment. But when Margaret asked if she wanted to live with her father all the time, Sarah's response had been unambiguous and heartbreaking in its clarity. No, I want to live with Mommy. She's my safe person. That single statement, spoken by a 3-year-old girl without any coaching or suggestion, had silenced the courtroom. Judge Patterson had made several notes. Even the court reporter, who'd been in the business of transcribing legal proceedings for 20 years, seemed moved by the raw honesty of a child's expressed preference to stay with her primary caregiver. Now, as Margaret concluded her examination and turned the witness over to the opposing counsel for cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Richard Thornton stood from his chair with visible reluctance. He'd spent weeks preparing to dismantle Jennifer's credibility, to paint her as distracted and neglectful, to present his client as a father equally capable of providing Sarah with a stable home. But the child on the witness stand had just described, in her own simple but devastating language, a mother who was anything but negligent, a mother who was present, attuned, protective, and deeply loved. Thornton approached the witness stand with considerably less swagger than he'd displayed that morning. His expensive suit and polished shoes clicked against the courtroom floor in the silence that seemed to stretch before him. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to control narratives, to find the weak points in testimony and exploit them, to transform hesitant or ambiguous statements into admissions of guilt or incompetence. But how does an attorney cross-examine a 3-year-old girl about her love for her mother? How does he suggest that her testimony is unreliable or influenced when her responses have been so clearly spontaneous and genuine? "Sarah," Thornton began, his voice taking on a tone that might have sounded friendly to a casual observer, but which actually contained calculated manipulation. "You said your mommy sometimes gets angry. Can you tell me about a time when your mommy got really, really angry?" This was a classic cross-examination technique, taking an admission and amplifying it, trying to transform a normal parental frustration into evidence of emotional instability or rage. But Sarah was calm, her hand still resting on Bailey's fur, and her response was matter-of-fact rather than alarmed. "She got frustrated when I spilled my juice," Sarah said thoughtfully. "She made a loud voice, but then she told me it was okay, that accidents happen. She helped me clean it up, and she hugged me." Thornton tried again, asking if her mother had ever raised her hand in a threatening manner, if she'd ever locked Sarah in a room, if she'd ever failed to feed her or care for her properly. With each question, Sarah responded with calm honesty that consistently painted Jennifer not as a perfect, unrealistic parent, but as a normal, responsive, loving mother. When Thornton asked if Sarah ever felt scared of her mother, the child shook her head firmly. "Mommy makes me feel safe," Sarah repeated, the same phrase she'd used earlier. "Even when she's frustrated or tired, I know she loves me." Bailey, sensing the subtle shift in Thornton's energy, the slight aggression in his tone despite his friendly words, leaned more firmly against the witness stand. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to give Sarah additional confidence. The dog was communicating, without words, that any threat directed toward this child would have to go through her first. 20 minutes into the cross-examination, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that Thornton's strategy was backfiring. Every question he asked, every attempt he made to plant doubt or confusion in Sarah's mind, simply resulted in another statement of her mother's love and dedication. Sarah wasn't contradicting herself. She wasn't becoming confused or defensive. She was simply, consistently, calmly reiterating the truth of her experience. At one point, Thornton asked Sarah if her mother had ever asked her to say nice things about her. It was a leading question designed to suggest that Jennifer had coached her daughter, that the testimony was contaminated by parental influence. But Sarah looked genuinely confused by the question. "Mommy doesn't tell me what to say," Sarah said simply. "She just loves me, and I love her." The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Patterson had stopped taking notes and was simply observing the interaction between the child and the attorney. Several members of the gallery had tears streaming down their faces. Even some of the bailiffs seemed moved by the child's steadfast, innocent honesty. When Thornton finally concluded his cross-examination and returned to his seat, he looked defeated in a way that went beyond mere legal setback. He looked like a man who just confronted the limits of his own power, who'd come face to face with a truth so pure and unambiguous that all his legal tactics and verbal sophistication had become irrelevant. As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she didn't immediately release Bailey. Instead, the little girl wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck in a tight, genuine embrace. Officer Chen allowed the moment to extend, understanding that what was occurring transcended courtroom procedure. Bailey had become, for Sarah, a symbol of safety and courage, a physical embodiment of the support that had allowed her to speak her truth. When Sarah finally released the dog and climbed down from the stand, Jennifer rushed from the gallery and scooped her daughter into her arms. The two held each other, and in that moment, something shifted in the courtroom. The legal proceeding continued, but the outcome felt predetermined. Sarah's testimony, facilitated by Bailey's presence, had transformed the case from a contested battle into something approaching resolution. That evening, after the proceedings had concluded for the day and the courtroom had emptied, Judge Patterson sat alone in his chambers. On his desk lay the transcript of Sarah's testimony. He read through it slowly, carefully, allowing the words to settle into his understanding. He'd overseen hundreds of custody cases, but rarely had he encountered testimony so emotionally compelling and legally significant from a witness so young. He thought about the dog, about the remarkable insight that had led Margaret Chen to request animal-assisted intervention for this child. He thought about how the presence of an animal had transformed a potentially traumatic experience into something that had allowed truth to emerge unobstructed by fear. And he began to contemplate what his ruling would be, knowing that Sarah's words had provided him with clear guidance about what was in the best interest of the child. Across the city, at a quiet home in a residential neighborhood, Jennifer held Sarah close as her daughter drifted off to sleep. The child had been exhausted but also proud of herself, understanding on some level that she'd done something important, something brave. Jennifer whispered to her sleeping daughter that she would always protect her, that she would always be her safe person, that they would face whatever came next together. And in an animal training facility across town, Bailey rested in her comfortable crate, her job for the day complete. Officer Chen sat nearby, scratching the dog behind her ears, acknowledging the extraordinary work Bailey had done. "You changed a life today," he whispered to the golden retriever. "You gave that little girl a voice." Bailey's tail wagged softly, a response to the affection, but also, or so it seemed to those who worked with her, an acknowledgement of the significance of the work she'd undertaken. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's testimony. 3 weeks of waiting, of uncertainty, of Jennifer trying to maintain normalcy while her entire future hung in the balance. She'd returned to her freelance work, attempting to concentrate on graphic design projects while her mind continually drifted toward the judge's chambers, wondering what Judge Patterson was thinking as he reviewed the case materials and wrote his ruling. She tried to maintain a composed exterior for Sarah's sake, but the stress had etched itself into her features, deeper lines around her eyes, a tension in her shoulders that no amount of stretching could release. Margaret had warned her that the wait could be weeks, even months. Family law judges often took considerable time to deliberate, especially in contested custody cases where the stakes were so high. They wanted to ensure they'd considered every angle, every piece of evidence, every legal precedent. But Margaret had also said something else, something that gave Jennifer a fragile thread of hope. "That testimony was extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it." Whatever the judge decides, he's going to have to acknowledge what he witnessed in that courtroom. The morning the ruling was handed down, Jennifer was in her home office when her phone rang. Margaret's voice came through, unusually excited and trying to maintain professional composure that her tone betrayed. "Jennifer, I just received the ruling. Judge Patterson made his decision. He's granting you primary custody with generous visitation rights for David. But that's not all. You need to read what he wrote." Jennifer's hand trembled as she held the phone. She'd prepared herself for either outcome, understanding that custody cases were unpredictable, that judges weighed evidence in ways that sometimes seemed arbitrary or influenced by factors beyond the actual facts. But hearing Margaret say the words "primary custody" felt like suddenly being able to breathe after months of suffocation. "There's more," Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Read the opinion," Margaret said. "The judge included something that I've never seen before in a custody ruling. He explicitly addressed the role of the support animal in the proceedings. You need to read it yourself." 2 hours later, Jennifer sat at her kitchen table with a printed copy of Judge Harold Patterson's written opinion. The legal language was formal and precise, but the content was extraordinary. Judge Patterson had systematically addressed each of Richard Thornton's arguments, methodically dismantling them with reference to the evidence presented during the trial. He'd reviewed the psychological evaluations, the financial records, the testimony from Jennifer's witnesses about her parenting. But the heart of his decision rested on Sarah's testimony. The minor child testified before this court with remarkable clarity and consistency, Judge Patterson had written. Her accounts of her daily life with her mother, her descriptions of maternal warmth and attunement, her expressed preference to remain in her mother's primary care. These statements carried the weight of authentic experience, articulated without the sophistication that might suggest coaching or rehearsal. To the contrary, the child's responses were characterized by the spontaneity and emotional truth that only genuine lived experience can provide. Jennifer read those words over and over, tears streaming down her face. The judge had understood. He'd recognized that Sarah hadn't been coached, that her testimony had been authentic, that her love for her mother was genuine and evident. But then came the section that would ripple through Colorado's legal community and beyond. Judge Patterson had made an unusual addition to his custody opinion, a formal acknowledgement of the role of victim support animals in family law proceedings. This court has overseen numerous custody evaluations throughout its tenure, the judge had written. In the present case, the court approved the use of a certified victim support animal to provide emotional support to the minor witness. The presence of this animal appeared to facilitate the child's ability to regulate her own nervous system and access her authentic testimony. The scientific literature supports the efficacy of animal-assisted interventions in reducing anxiety and cortisol levels in young witnesses. More importantly, the practical application of this intervention in the present case produced testimony of such clarity and credibility as to significantly impact this court's assessment of the case. The child in question was protected from the re-traumatization that might occur in a traditional interrogation environment, while simultaneously being enabled to provide testimony that was more authentic and credible than might have been possible without such support. This case demonstrates that our legal system, while fundamentally designed to ascertain truth, must sometimes adapt its procedures to ensure that the most vulnerable among us, particularly young children, can access their own voices without the overwhelming burden of courtroom anxiety and fear. The use of trained support animals represents a promising and evidence-based approach to ensuring both justice and child welfare in family law proceedings. This court commends the efforts of the nonprofit organization that trained and provided the support animal in this case. This court further recommends that other judicial systems consider implementing similar programs to protect vulnerable witnesses while simultaneously enhancing the reliability of their testimony. Jennifer read the section about Bailey multiple times. She couldn't believe that a judge would take the time to write such a comprehensive endorsement of animal-assisted intervention in a custody case. But Judge Patterson had done exactly that, elevating Sarah's experience and Bailey's role from a single case to a potential model for legal reform. The ruling itself was not unexpected. Jennifer had hoped for primary custody based on the strength of her parenting and Sarah's clear preference. But the judge's written decision gave her something more valuable than the custody arrangement itself. It gave her vindication. It showed that the judge understood the truth of her relationship with her daughter, that he recognized the integrity of Sarah's testimony, and that he believed in the approach that had made that testimony possible. Within days, the ruling made local news. A journalist from the Denver Post wrote a lengthy article titled, "When Justice Meets Compassion: How a Support Dog Changed Everything for One Family." The article highlighted not just the custody outcome, but Judge Patterson's broader observations about animal-assisted interventions in legal proceedings. Within weeks, Legal scholars began citing the opinion in academic papers. Family law attorneys across Colorado and beyond began discussing the implications of Patterson's ruling for their own practices. The nonprofit organization that had trained Bailey received hundreds of calls and emails. Donors wanted to support the program. Other courthouses wanted to implement similar initiatives. Legal advocates working with vulnerable populations, child abuse survivors, domestic violence victims, sexually assaulted individuals, began requesting that support animals be made available in their cases. What had started as a single mother's desperate effort to help her terrified daughter navigate a courtroom had become something far larger. Sarah's case became a catalyst for change in the legal system, a demonstration that justice and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that protecting the most vulnerable witnesses could actually enhance rather than compromise the pursuit of truth. Jennifer scheduled an appointment with Judge Patterson to thank him personally, a gesture that was unusual but not unprecedented. When she entered his chambers with Sarah holding her hand, the judge rose from behind his desk and, in a moment of informality that suggested his deep engagement with their case, bent down to shake Sarah's hand. "You were very brave," he told Sarah, "and you helped me understand the truth. That's one of the most important things anyone can do." Sarah, now more confident and secure in the knowledge that she and her mother would be staying together, smiled shyly but genuinely. "Bailey helped me be brave," she said simply. Judge Patterson straightened and looked at Jennifer. "Your daughter's instinct is correct. The dog facilitated her courage, but that courage was always within her. What the animal did was create the safety necessary for courage to emerge. That's a lesson for all of us about what vulnerable people often need, not pressure or interrogation, but the presence of unconditional support." He handed Jennifer a formal letter he'd written, addressed to the nonprofit organization that trained support animals, formally recommending that additional funding and judicial support be directed toward expanding their program to other courthouses throughout the state. As Jennifer and Sarah left the judge's chambers, Sarah tugged on her mother's hand. "Can we see Bailey?" she asked. Jennifer smiled through fresh tears. She'd been asking Margaret the same question. 6 weeks had passed since Judge Patterson issued his ruling. 6 weeks of Sarah asking almost daily when she could see Bailey again. 6 weeks of Jennifer making phone calls to Officer Marcus Chen and the nonprofit organization, trying to coordinate a reunion that felt appropriately meaningful. The organization's director, a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who'd founded the nonprofit 15 years earlier, had immediately understood the significance of what Jennifer was requesting. She'd seen countless cases where the bond between a child and a support animal transcended the boundaries of legal proceedings, creating lasting emotional connections that could continue to support healing long after the courtroom drama had concluded. "We're hosting our annual fundraiser and graduation ceremony in 6 weeks, Dr. Rodriguez had explained to Jennifer during their phone conversation. "It's an event where newly trained support dogs are introduced to the community, where we honor the work of our handlers, and where we celebrate the successes of cases like yours. I'd like to formally invite you and Sarah to be our guests of honor. Bailey will be there, and I think it would be healing for all parties involved." Sarah's excitement upon hearing the news had been palpable. The little girl had drawn pictures of Bailey every day since the courtroom proceedings had concluded. She'd created a scrapbook filled with memories of the dog, the day they met, the feeling of Bailey's fur under her fingers, the way the dog had made her feel brave. Jennifer had laminated Sarah's drawings and photographs, creating a physical monument to the bond that had transformed their lives. The morning of the event, Jennifer dressed Sarah in a yellow sundress that the child had picked out specifically for the occasion. "Bailey will like yellow," Sarah had insisted when shopping with her mother. "It's like sunshine, and Bailey makes everything bright and happy." Jennifer had smiled at her daughter's poetic understanding of what Bailey represented, not just comfort or support, but light in the midst of darkness, hope when everything had seemed hopeless. The community center where the nonprofit held its annual event was transformed into a celebration of human-animal connection. Long tables displayed information about the organization's work, their training methods, their success stories. Video monitors played footage of support dogs working with vulnerable witnesses, with therapy patients, with individuals recovering from trauma. Puppies in the early stages of training tumbled over each other in a specially designed play area, while more advanced dogs worked through complex behavioral scenarios under the watchful eyes of trainers. When Sarah and Jennifer arrived, they were immediately greeted by Dr. Alina Rodriguez, a woman with warm brown eyes and the kind of presence that immediately conveyed competence and compassion. She embraced Jennifer and knelt down to greet Sarah at eye level. "Sarah, I've heard so much about you," Dr. Rodriguez said genuinely. "You were incredibly brave in that courtroom. Do you know how many other children will be helped because of what you did, because of what you and Bailey accomplished together?" Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling, clearly pleased by the adult's recognition of her significance. Dr. Rodriguez stood and turned to Jennifer. "Bailey is here," she said. "Officer Chen arrived an hour ago with her. She's in the back area where the senior dogs are resting between their demonstrations. I think it would be meaningful for you two to reunite with her away from the crowd first, before we do the formal introduction. Give them time to remember each other privately." Jennifer's heart swelled at the sensitivity of this arrangement. She nodded gratefully, and Dr. Rodriguez led them through the community center toward a quieter back area where several trained dogs rested on cushioned beds, their handlers nearby. As they approached, Jennifer scanned the room, searching for the familiar golden coat. And then she saw her. Bailey was resting on a blue cushion, her head resting on her paws, but her eyes alert and aware. When the dog caught sight of Sarah, her entire body seemed to come alive. Her tail began wagging with what could only be described as recognition and joy, not the frantic, desperate joy of a dog seeing any child, but the specific, knowing joy of an animal recognizing a beloved individual she'd bonded with during a significant shared experience. Officer Marcus Chen, who was sitting nearby monitoring Bailey, stood and smiled broadly. "She's been asking about you," he said to Sarah, his voice warm with genuine affection. "Every day since the courtroom, she seems to look for you." Sarah broke away from Jennifer's hand and walked slowly toward Bailey, as if approaching something precious and fragile. The dog rose from her cushion and moved toward the child with the same measured, intentional movements she'd used in the courtroom. When they met, they fell into each other's arms with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of everyone observing. Bailey lowered herself to the ground, and Sarah wrapped her small body around the dog's neck, burying her face in the golden fur. The reunion lasted several minutes. No words, no performance, just the pure, uncomplicated connection between a child and the animal who'd helped her find her courage during the most frightening experience of her life. "She remembers you," Officer Chen said softly to Sarah. "Dogs don't forget people they've helped. Bailey considers you part of her family now." Sarah pulled back slightly and looked at the dog with wonder. "Forever?" she asked. "Forever," Officer Chen confirmed. Jennifer found herself unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. She'd brought Sarah to this reunion knowing it would be meaningful, but witnessing the depth of the bond between her daughter and this extraordinary dog exceeded anything she'd imagined. This wasn't just a child enjoying a pet. This was a recognition of shared experience, of mutual support, of an unbreakable connection forged in a moment of vulnerability and courage. Later, after Sarah and Bailey had spent more time together in private, Dr. Rodriguez invited them to the main event area where the formal program was beginning. A significant crowd had gathered: donors, supporters of the nonprofit, families who'd benefited from the organization's work, media representatives, and legal professionals interested in animal-assisted interventions. When Dr. Rodriguez announced that Sarah and Jennifer were present and invited them to the stage, the applause that erupted seemed to shake the rafters. Sarah, holding Jennifer's hand, walked to the front of the room where Officer Chen was waiting with Bailey. The dog's handler guided Bailey to stand beside the little girl, and the image was captured by photographers from multiple news outlets. A 3-year-old girl in a yellow sundress, her hand on a golden retriever's head, both of them looking toward the audience with a composed dignity that belied their ages. Sarah Mitchell and her mother Jennifer have traveled here today to share their story, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying across the silent room. 6 weeks ago, Sarah testified in a custody hearing with the support of Bailey, one of our certified victim support dogs. That testimony was so powerful, so authentic, that it not only changed the trajectory of one family's life, it also influenced a judge to formally recommend that support animal programs be expanded throughout Colorado's legal system. Sarah, you showed incredible courage. You showed that when we give vulnerable people, especially children, the right kind of support, they can access their own authentic voices and speak their truths. You and Bailey have become a symbol of what's possible when we integrate compassion into our pursuit of justice. The room erupted in applause. Several people stood, initiating a standing ovation. Sarah, overwhelmed by the attention, pressed against Bailey, and the dog seemed to understand. Bailey simply stood there, providing a living anchor for the child at the center of all this recognition. Throughout the evening, Sarah and Bailey were inseparable. They participated in a demonstration where other trained dogs showed their skills, but Sarah's attention was focused entirely on her partner. When Bailey was recognized formally as the animal at the center of a landmark case, Sarah beamed with pride, not for herself, but for her companion. As the event concluded and families began to leave, Sarah asked Jennifer the question she'd been anticipating all evening. Can Bailey come home with us, Mommy? Can she live with us forever? Jennifer looked at Officer Chen, wondering how to navigate this request. Chen smiled knowingly. Bailey's primary role is working with the organization, he explained gently to Sarah. She has other children to help who are scared just like you were, but you can visit her here, and I think we can arrange for you to be Bailey's special volunteer helper as she continues her work. Would you like that? Sarah nodded enthusiastically, seeming to understand that Bailey had important work to do, important people to help. But the promise of ongoing connection seemed to satisfy her. As they drove home that evening, Sarah fell asleep in her car seat, clutching a photograph of herself and Bailey that Dr. Rodriguez had provided. Jennifer glanced at her daughter, thinking about how far they'd come from that terrifying morning in the courthouse hallway. Sarah had survived not just the legal proceeding, but had transcended it, had grown from a frightened child into a girl who understood that sometimes courage requires partnership, that sometimes we need another being to help us access our own strength. And in that moment, Jennifer made a silent promise to herself that she would never forget what Bailey had given them, not just the legal victory, but the lived experience of being supported through fear, the understanding that love and connection could emerge in the most unexpected places, the knowledge that healing was possible. 5 years had passed since that pivotal morning in the Denver courtroom. 5 years since a frightened 3-year-old girl had placed her hand on a golden retriever's head and found the courage to speak her truth. 5 years during which the ripples of that single moment had expanded far beyond what anyone could have anticipated, transforming not just one family's life, but an entire legal system's approach to vulnerability and justice. The story of Sarah and Bailey had first appeared in local Denver news outlets, a heartwarming human interest piece about an unusual custody case and the dog who'd made all the difference. But the narrative had evolved. Legal scholars began citing Judge Patterson's decision in academic journals. Family law attorneys across Colorado started requesting that support animals be made available in their cases. Other judicial districts contacted the nonprofit organization, asking for guidance on how to implement similar programs. The nonprofit organization that had trained Bailey, originally operating on a modest budget and serving a limited geographic area, had experienced exponential growth. Donations had poured in from across the country. Corporate sponsors, moved by the story of Sarah and Bailey, had contributed substantial funds. The organization had expanded from training 3 to 4 dogs per year to maintaining a program that trained and placed 15 certified support animals annually. More significantly, the program had expanded beyond family law courtrooms. Support dogs were now working in dependency and neglect hearings, in sexual assault cases, in domestic violence trials. Every jurisdiction that implemented the program reported the same phenomenon that Judge Patterson had observed. Vulnerable witnesses testified more coherently, more completely, and more credibly when supported by a calm animal presence. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the nonprofit's founder, had been invited to speak before legislative committees, to consult with judicial reform organizations, and to present her work at national conferences on trauma-informed justice. She'd been profiled in national magazines, featured on morning news programs, and had become something of an evangelist for the integration of animal-assisted interventions into legal proceedings. But for all the systemic change that had occurred, the most profound transformation had been personal. The continued evolution of Sarah and her relationship with Bailey, and the way that bond had reshaped Sarah's understanding of herself and her place in the world. Now 8 years old, Sarah was no longer the frightened, trembling child who'd sat in a witness stand 5 years earlier. She was a confident, articulate girl who'd grown into her own kind of advocate. She volunteered regularly at the nonprofit organization, helping to socialize the dogs in training, teaching other children about animal-assisted interventions, and telling her story to anyone who would listen. Jennifer had documented their journey in a memoir that had been published by a small press and had subsequently been picked up by a major publisher. Finding Her Voice, A Mother's Fight for Her Daughter and the Dog Who Made It Possible, had become a bestseller in the parenting and criminal justice reform categories. Jennifer's book was now required reading in several law schools' courses on trauma-informed justice. She'd left her freelance graphic design work and had become a full-time advocate, speaking at conferences, working with organizations focused on child protection and legal reform. Sarah attended the same elementary school where she'd started before the custody battle, but now she was enrolled in the school's advanced academic track. Her teacher reported that Sarah was a natural leader, empathetic, and remarkably articulate about emotional concepts. The girl who'd been so anxious and withdrawn during her parents' custody dispute had blossomed into a child with remarkable emotional intelligence and resilience. But her most important role remained her volunteer work with the nonprofit organization. Every Saturday, Sarah and Jennifer would drive to the facility where Bailey now lived permanently. Bailey had retired from active courtroom duty 3 years earlier, having helped over 40 vulnerable witnesses navigate traumatic legal proceedings. Officer Marcus Chen had proposed that Bailey transition to a new role, working directly with the organization as an ambassador and therapeutic dog for the training program itself. Sarah's relationship with Bailey had become something deeper and more meaningful than either Jennifer or Officer Chen could have predicted. The dog had become, in many ways, Sarah's external conscience, a living embodiment of the courage she'd accessed 5 years earlier. The girl would confide in Bailey, tell the dog about her worries, her anxieties, her uncertainties about growing up. And Bailey, with the understanding that only a dog who'd been through a transformative experience could possess, would simply be present, offering unconditional acceptance and support. The story had taken on mythological proportions in legal circles. Lawyers would reference the Sarah and Bailey case when discussing animal-assisted interventions. Young women studying family law would write papers about the case as a turning point in their understanding of trauma-informed justice. Law schools began incorporating discussions of the case into their curricula, not just as an example of effective legal strategy, but as a meditation on the nature of truth, vulnerability, and what it means to create systems of justice that protect rather than traumatize the most vulnerable. Judge Harold Patterson, now retired, had authored a groundbreaking book titled Justice and Compassion: Lessons from an Unexpected Case. The book was part memoir, part legal analysis, examining how a support animal had fundamentally challenged his assumptions about courtroom procedure and the pursuit of truth. Patterson had become something of a philosopher judge, giving lectures at universities and legal conferences about the intersection of human vulnerability and legal systems. Richard Thornton, Sarah's father's attorney, had experienced a different kind of transformation. After the case concluded, he'd taken time away from family law, disturbed by something he'd witnessed in that courtroom, a moment when all his legal tactics and verbal sophistication had proven irrelevant in the face of a child's simple, profound honesty. He'd eventually returned to law, but with a fundamentally different approach. He'd begun specializing in collaborative law and mediation rather than adversarial litigation. He'd even worked with Judge Patterson on developing guidelines for more ethical and humane approaches to family law proceedings. David Mitchell, Sarah's father, had largely disappeared from public narrative. He'd maintained his visitation rights, but the relationship between father and daughter had remained distant. Sarah, with remarkable maturity, had expressed compassion for her father's struggles, but she'd also been clear that her mother was her primary source of safety and security. The custody arrangement had evolved over the years, but Jennifer remained the parent with whom Sarah primarily resided. On the 5th anniversary of Sarah's courtroom testimony, a documentary film about the case premiered at a legal film festival. The courage in her voice, Sarah, Bailey, and the Case That Changed Justice, was a 90-minute exploration of how one child's testimony, facilitated by an animal's presence, had catalyzed systemic change. The film included interviews with Judge Patterson, Dr. Rodriguez, Officer Chen, Margaret Chen the attorney, and many other children and families who'd been helped through the nonprofit's programs. When Sarah watched the documentary at its premiere, she wept, not from sadness, but from the realization of what she and Bailey had accomplished together. She understood, in a way that only a now 8-year-old girl who'd been through such an experience could understand, that her bravery had mattered, that her willingness to speak her truth had rippled outward in ways that continued to protect children she'd never meet. After the screening, Sarah and Jennifer walked to their car, and Sarah asked the question she asked almost every week: "Can we go see Bailey tomorrow?" Jennifer smiled. "We always do, sweetie, we always will." That night, Jennifer sat at her computer and began writing notes for the updated edition of her memoir. She wanted to chronicle the 5 years since that courtroom morning, to document how a single moment of connection between a child and a dog had transformed from a personal victory into a movement toward more humane, trauma-informed legal systems. Meanwhile, at the nonprofit organization's facility, Bailey rested in her comfortable quarters. Officer Chen sat beside the aging golden retriever, scratching behind her ears the way he'd done thousands of times over the years. "You changed the world, you know," he whispered to the dog. "One little girl at a time, one courtroom at a time, one small moment of connection at a time, you changed the world." Bailey's tail wagged softly, her eyes closing in contentment. The dog had no understanding of the systemic change she'd catalyzed, no comprehension of the thousands of lives she'd impacted. But she understood something simpler and more profound. She understood that she had mattered, that her presence had made a difference, that love, in its most pure and unconditional form, could transform fear into courage. And in that understanding, she embodied the truest lesson of her story, that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't legislation or policy or brilliant legal arguments. Sometimes it's simply the presence of a being who cares, who shows up, who says through her very existence, "You are not alone, you are worthy of support, you are capable of more courage than you know." Years would pass. Sarah would grow older, graduate from high school, attend university. She would become an advocate in her own right, founding organizations dedicated to animal-assisted interventions in legal systems. Bailey would eventually pass away, mourned by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched. But the story would endure, passed down through legal education, through families who'd been helped, through a culture slowly learning that justice and compassion weren't opposites but essential partners in creating systems that truly served the vulnerable. And it had all begun with a 3-year-old girl pointing at a golden retriever in a courtroom, and everyone watching to see what would happen next.